I'm pleased to welcome back to the podcast my guest today. He was actually the main reason that this podcast came to be. The primary goal of our podcast is to provide some oral history surrounding key events and issues that have impacted Waterloo Region through the 70s to the present. And my guest today has been in the eye of the storm, quote, through much of that time. One could say that he's forgotten more about the recent history of Waterloo Region and local politics than any will ever know. But that would be wrong because he doesn't forget anything. I consider him our local historian. I'm pleased to welcome back my friend Ken Seiling, not only an old gray mayor, but an old gray chair.
Well, good to be back.
Good to have you back, Ken. You know, it's always.
And I have forgotten lots.
Yeah, you don't have to admit it. We'll just let the legend live on. But it's always fun to talk to you because I was thinking about this the other day. It's like talking to you is like sitting in a big old comfy couch. You just like to lounge around and chit and chat and stuff. And next thing you know, like time's just flown by and you're saying, oh, wait, that went by quick. So it's always a sign of a good conversation. So Ken, why don't you just give us a quick update on some of the things you're up to these days? It's always interesting to see how you're still tapped into the community.
Well, we've been spending splitting our time between home and the cottage, trying to find a sort of a suitable pod, I guess, or bubble that we've had with the summer, particularly with some of the family. But now that the kids have gone back to school, we have really stepped back and we aren't seeing any of our grandchildren other than by FaceTiming. And
wow.
So we've been doing that, but I've also been doing a bit of work on the side. I've stood on one of the hospital boards. I'm on the board of the new United Way for the region of Waterloo, and I'm also sitting on the board of the Elora Festival and Elora Singers. So that keeps my finger in a few things, and I spend a lot of time talking to my friends and colleagues. I try not to interfere in things too much, but I always keep posted. And when you still live in the community, I mean, there's some value in moving away, as some people do when they retire, because in this case, having been in it for 40 plus years, everything that goes on is in my face daily. So it's hard to be removed and have an interest. But by the same token, I respect the fact that I'm not there anymore. And so others have to take on the mantle.
So your tongue has a lot of teeth marks in it.
It sure does.
So, did you say hospital boards or just the one hospital board?
The province appointed me to the Grand River Hospital Board about a year ago, so I've been sitting on there. I have a 2-year appointment. And, to the hospital board. And
you mentioned United Way, so it was interesting. I was just as an aside in the news recently, I guess they launched a campaign, but with no dollar figure target.
Right, because as I don't think it's any surprise that United Ways across Canada are sort of trying to restructure themselves, recreate themselves, because a lot of the things that traditionally they did to raise money are no longer feasible. So, for example, workplace campaigns, people are working at home. There aren't places to work that kind of campaign, there's a real push on in the whole volunteer nonprofit sector to raise funding. So, I think there are new challenges, and the United Way is sort of trying to recreate itself to meet needs, because I think some people still forget that so many of the agencies in our community rely on United Way funding for their operations, and they're finding it tough to make money too. So I think that one of the things is how to get that message out to the community that there's such a broad range of services that United Way helps and supports, that we really need to find a way to make sure that it survives and continues to be able to provide that support. So that's one of the challenges right now.
And the other thing I was just thinking about too was in terms of meetings, I mean, as regional chair, when you're a regional chair, on an annual basis or monthly basis, like how often would you be out and about in the community going to events?
Well, that's a big part of the job that's disappeared, I think, for my successor. And certainly we tracked them one year, maybe it was an exceptional year, but I went to about 400 to 500 events during that 1 year that we tracked them. So there's lots going on, and I think the role of the regional chair really is to try and pull the community together and get to know the community. So it makes, I'm sure for Karen, my successor, it's a much tougher job because she just can't get out to functions and see people and relate to people. So she's pretty limited to the formal meetings and working with staff, and that's a big drawback right now for the current situation.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean that's how you tap into what's going on. On another podcast, I had mentioned that when I ran for mayor, I think one of the things that helped me out indirectly was the fact that the incumbent never got out to any events and didn't know the community, didn't know the people. And when you can't get out there and meet people and see what's happening, you're not tapped in. You don't understand what the needs, wants, and who the key players are in your community.
Yeah, you need to know the pulse out there, and if you don't have a way of getting that, and you can't rely, I mean, the counselors will have a sense of the pulse too, but you have to know it personally. You have to know the key players.
Yeah. We won't get into any recent social media posts during Oktoberfest conversation. But let's, I just wanted to, we're going to talk about police services in Waterloo Region from a historical perspective, okay? But before we get into that, I thought we should just touch on, because it just dawned on me, we hear about Spanish flu and other prior pandemics. And obviously SARS was something that consumed a lot of time and attention in the community. And I was thinking back to 08, 09 when I was in private practice before becoming mayor. And I remember chatting with staff generally about, it's keep calm and carry on, in the sense that our business will keep moving on. We'll see what happens, see how things develop, and you would bump into sanitizer units in the hallways or the lobbies of office buildings. So what was it like as regional chair back then when you were dealing with that SARS issue here in Waterloo Region?
Well, at the time, the idea of a pandemic was sort of a new idea. I mean, we'd heard historically, I heard about them. It was the first time we'd seen that sort of thing happen. And I think, as I recall back at that time, most people initially thought it was really a Toronto-based problem, but it had the potential of spreading out. And so increasingly, we were getting directives from public health and from the provincial public health and from our own people that we needed to take steps to try and prevent spread in the community. I think very fortunately that at the time we got as a province of the country, we got on top of it very quickly. And I think the SARS, although it was serious at the time, it didn't develop to the extent that the COVID has. And so once that whole thing was done and some of the steps or measures were in place, we didn't have lockdowns, but we had hand sanitizing and I think some restrictions on visiting and things like that, where there's an opportunity after the fact to at least create some planning for the future. And so the region did, with the area municipalities, created a master plan in the event of a pandemic coming in the future. And so that's what kicked into place this time around.
Yeah, because I don't think people realize that regional, and correct me if I'm incorrect, because I know we did touch on this when we were together on regional council, that the regional council is it the health board of the region, or what is it?
In the regions, the boards of health the formal boards of health were disbanded and the regional council became the board of health. So when regional council sits and deals with health matters, they're sitting as the board of health. That's something that recently been under discussion because this new government had wanted to take public health away from municipalities. And for years, we've been fighting a strong battle to say we need a holistic approach to public health. And it just isn't public health, people. It ties into engineering, it ties into social services, it ties into a whole range of things. And so there's been a battle going on for the last 2 years to try and maintain public health at the municipal level. And so we'll see what happens when this finishes off, but it's been very good that they can pull it all together.
So prior to 2008, you said there was a health board of medical people?
Well, no, there wasn't. After the SARS event, we pulled together a planning exercise to say, if they have another epidemic, what would we do? How would we tackle this? How would we manage this from a municipal level for the municipal functions? Yeah. That plan was put in place for following 2008.
Yeah. So, and what you were pointing out is that from a municipal level or regional level, because you're tapped into infrastructure, social services, and other things, it's the most logical level to have this sort of health board at that level because you can provide a more coordinated effort.
That's right. There's a synergy between all the services doing it together, and also people are feet in the ground. So if your board of health is operating out of Hamilton, for example, you really don't have the kinds of community input and activity that's available too, because what they're trying to do is consolidate them into large areas and large territories. And
is this like the LIN where they're consolidating the LINs? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's going on at the same time. So this is
Oh,
all part of the process that they're looking at doing right now. And I think there's some resistance to some of it, particularly in the public health area.
yeah. I think COVID's probably made the current provincial government realize a lot of things that might not be done the way they had originally intended to do them.
Well, I think there are arguments in this case. Somebody would say, well, we should have one person in Toronto directing everybody on the field. But and then there are others who are saying you get a much better response if you do local planning and you can
Yeah,
deal with the issues locally and you're right on top of them. So
yeah.
in my viewpoint, it's best left at the local level.
So prior to '08, then we didn't really have a pandemic playbook in the community.
Not that, no,
Was it something that was ever thought about, or it's just this? It's like,
I think 208 SARS was the first real pandemic in my memory of
yeah,
anything. I mean, there was polio back in the 50s, but that wasn't
right.
seen as a pandemic. It was seen as a serious issue, and I think it was dealt with at a provincial level, not a local level.
Right. And flu is something that's recurring every year that's dealt with, but it's not in this coordinate, other than flu shots. I remember getting some flu shots
Yeah.
at the region, but not in this pandemic that we're dealing with.
No, because flus, although they can be severe, and flus do cause death. They're sort of the normal course of events, and people just took them in stride as a seasonal illness that came
Right.
along, and that's
Yeah.
why flu shots came into being. But nothing on the scale of COVID, which spread is extremely rapid and difficult to contain, and in its initial stages, it hammered nursing homes and long-term care facilities.
Yeah.
Spread easily initially among seniors, but now younger people as well.
Yeah. So yeah. So post SARS then a playbook was developed to deal with pandemics in the future, and to the best of your knowledge, that was the foundation of what was done going forward under
Right.
COVID.
Right, and even so, some of that was there's some things that can be done locally, some things needed provincial direction or provincial legislation
Right,
or
right.
but it tried to marry everything that was within local control, so
Yeah.
that if this happened, this is what we do. This is what we can do within the range of municipal responsibilities or abilities legally. And so that there was a coordinated effort doing it, so you wouldn't have something going on in Kitchener and then North Dunford would be doing something different,
Right,
or Elmira
right.
doing something different, to try and make sure that everybody was dealing on from the same page.
Yeah, one place to look to start anyway, and then you develop from there.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. All right, well, thanks for sharing that. I know we hadn't talked about that, and I kind of just threw that at you. So, but see, there you go. Like I said, local historian. So we're going to talk about police services in Waterloo Region from the historical context, because I thought it'd be interesting to understand how we came to have the services we have today. You know, and because, you know, some people say, well, you've got one police services in the community, but you have still fractured or multiple fire departments in the community. And I think for some people, they kind of see these two things as emergency services. Why aren't they all the same? It's like ambulance services. You don't have individual
No.
ambulance or you know, services or paramedics in each of the 7 municipalities.
Right.
So it was my understanding that this combining came about in 73, the creation of our Waterloo Regional Police. Well, back then, I guess Force it was called, or now Services.
Yep. So prior to the municipal reforms of the late 60s and early 70s, people either had their own police force, each municipality each had its own police force, or they had OPP policing. And so in this region, there was Kitchener, Waterloo, Galt, Preston, Hespeler, Elmira, Waterloo Township. Did I say New Hamburg?
Yeah, New Hamburg and Bridgeport.
Bridgeport, yeah. All had separate police forces, and the rest of them were covered off by the Ontario Provincial Police. So there's this multiplicity of jurisdictions and policing and different levels of competency as well. So you can imagine some of the smaller ones would have 2 or 3 police officers compared to the others, and so you didn't have the ability to have a combination of resources for specialization and
Right. Was it like Dukes of Hazzard? If I crossed from Kitchener into Waterloo, they couldn't touch me.
I'm not sure, but I mean, I think they tried to cooperate, but we had this multiplicity of police forces, and so it made a lot of
Yeah.
sense as part of the regional framework to pull them all together into one regional force.
Well, yeah, as I was researching that and looking it up, I was amazed that we had that many disparate police forces, plus the OPP operating. I think North Dumfries had the OPP, so I think all the townships, the current townships, had OPP forces.
Certainly, Woolwich and Wilmot and Wellesley, I think, had OPP, as I recall.
Yeah, and it might have been North Dumfries as well. So combining all of that, though, did that just happen? I mean, in '73, were you an elected official in '73?
No, I wasn't.
So you were just a teacher in Elmira.
I was teaching at that time. Yep.
Were you? Okay. And you got first elected. What year was that you got first elected?
76, 77, I think.
Okay, so shortly thereafter. So you would have been aware of all of this going on at the time.
Right.
Was this all part of the creation of the region, and therefore they created the police force at the same time?
Right. So the way the province did it in those days was the province actually sent in a commissioner or somebody to review the situation and make recommendations on what the future governments would look like. And there was pretty general consensus that something needed to be done. There wasn't outright opposition. There were different scenarios as to what might be done. So at the end of the day, the province decided, picked a plan, and they actually wrote legislation and imposed it. So it wasn't a matter of, here are your choices. Here's what you pick, what you want to do locally. They had their hearings. The commissioner did his thing and made recommendations back, and then the province implemented. There wasn't any opportunity to change the.
Was the commissioner a local appointee or somebody out of Toronto, or
out of Toronto?
Makes it easier that way.
Yeah. And
that's local.
I'm having a memory lapse. I should know his name. His name is right there, but I just can't remember it right now. Anyway, so and part of that, they dictated what was going to happen. So they set up the structure. They chose which amalgamations would take place. They chose which services would move to the new regional government. They chose the model for policing, those sorts of things. So that was all done and imposed. Legislation was passed in 1972. There was an interim regional council elected in 1972, the provisional council, and they supervised. Jack Young was appointed early on, and they supervised the creation of the new municipality and where it was going to go, and also the creation of the police force.
And the interim was all members from the various municipalities, the 7 municipalities.
No, there were elections held, as I recall, in '72 to elect the interim council. I need to check my history.
They weren't appointees from the various municipalities.
No, they were. My recollection is they were elected, but I should have checked my history today.
That's okay, no problem. So I guess it begs one of the questions then that comes to mind is, why wasn't the fire department amalgamated at the same time as police services?
Well, there's nothing in writing, but my understanding and talking to people and taking a look back at that time was that it was the police forces the fire departments were full-time fire departments in some of the urban municipalities, Kitchener, Waterloo, Galt. I can't speak to Preston. I think Hesper was volunteer, but I'm not sure. And in the townships, they were all volunteer fire departments. Yeah. So at that time, there was no model which allowed you to mix full-time firefighters with volunteers.
Oh.
So I think the concern was that if you impose a regional fire department, everybody would have full-time firefighters, and certainly the rural municipalities didn't want to have they didn't want the cost of having a full-time fire department. They wanted to continue with volunteers. So there was no model for doing that at that time. It's since been developed and they exist today, but they didn't in those days. And so I think they were just trying to keep volunteer fire departments and avoid the cost of having everybody full-time.
Right. Yeah, I remember, I grew up in Waterloo and then moved out to North Dumfries. And when I got to North Dumfries, I found out it's a volunteer fire department. And I thought, oh, that's quaint. I thought it was just small town, rare situations because you have this. But you soon learn there are more volunteer firefighters in this country by almost a factor of 8 to 1, I think, or 7 to 1 or 8 to 1 than there are full-time or paid full-time firefighters.
Right. And, there was a real campaign on the part of the professional firefighters unions to try and take over more and more. And there was a lot of resistance. And in fact, until just the last year, you recall there was the second Hatters things where.
Yeah, about impact on your disability insurance.
So what they also wanted to prevent, they were any full-time firefighter, if he volunteered, could lose his job. So,
right.
Now, I think the provincial government now has stepped in to disallow that from happening, but
yeah,
that carried on for some time.
Yeah, which was a real shame that it was an issue for a while because, look at the volunteer firefighters do a great job. They're training all the time to stay up to speed. And, it's amazing. These are your friends, your families, members, your neighbors who are risking their lives at times, to deal with a barn fire or, some major, even industrial fires that they have to deal with. And it's nice to be able to call upon the services of an experienced firefighter from the full-time service who would be able to lend their knowledge and skill to complement what's going on in the volunteer force.
So, and the volunteer fire services have provided great service and excellent service. They're highly trained. I think in some areas they've been having difficulty getting enough volunteers. I can't say within this region, but across the province generally. So reducing the pool of available people was difficult. But I think I've been out of the loop for a while, but I think that has been changed now. I think the province has legislated to allow it to happen. Ted Arnott, he was the champion of that for many years.
Okay, good.
No success, but when the government came into power, I think they put it through, as I recall.
Yeah, and I know especially there was the concern for some of the full-time guys that if they developed an illness, because maybe they dealt with a chemical fire someplace, right? And then there was an issue. Well, did you get it as a full-time firefighter or did you get it as a volunteer firefighter?
Yeah.
And those could be very difficult to sort out, just like that recent series about Uniroyal and the illnesses that workers had from that, and workers' compensation issues. But yeah, it's nice that got sorted out, so it opens that up. And I think you have to open up because over time, it just seems that generally, when you look at volunteer organizations, the average age is getting older and older. Young people are not necessarily volunteering for whether it's a Rotary or the Knights of Columbus or the Kinsmen or what have you. And I think that might be shifting the touch to the firefighter side, especially as townships get larger. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I look at the growth of what's happening in North Dumfries, it's phenomenal. And I know other areas have to even staff more than one facility, which North Dumfries has one. But take Wilmot or Woolwich, for example, or Wellesley. I think Wellesley has 3 stations themselves, and they're even as similar size to North Dumfries.
Well, I think a lot has changed since the regions have been created, and one of the things that change that has taken place has been the fact that now there are mixed models where they have full-time and volunteer fire departments mixed, because volunteers are paid. I mean, it's a small amount, but they are paid.
Yeah.
But the models now exist, so you can have a combined type of fire department. So then that raises the question, why not a single fire service if in fact now these two models can be mixed? So that's a question for other people to resolve now, but it's one that I think when the regional reform agenda was discussed over the last few years, that always came to the top of the list.
Yeah, I think the Hamilton amalgamation seems to have pushed that whole firefighter, volunteer, and paid together, because I remember during the last municipal campaign running for regional chair, and I met with the Christian Labor Union, CLAC, and they had mentioned when I asked them who their members were included, a small portion of it included firefighters from Hamilton, which included the paid full-time and the volunteer, and it came about through that amalgamation.
If you go through the municipalities, particularly around the GTA, around Toronto, a lot of those that are with their southern stations are sufficiently populated that they can have full-time firefighters, but the northern ones aren't. They have mixed models, and they work successfully.
Yeah.
So I think that the irony is that there are 3 emergency services, and they all relate one to another: police, EMS, paramedic service, and firefighting. And so two of the 3 are at the regional level. It doesn't make sense to have but have a third not at the regional
Yeah.
level, and that would allow for better coordination. Would end the disputes about the questions about dispatch, who's dispatching, who's doing
Right.
what's the order returning to calls, all those sorts of things, and they could be all sort of dealt with at the regional level.
But
However, that's a discussion for another day.
yeah, another day, because on prior days, that's like amalgamation discussions.
Yeah,
There's certain municipalities that it's a no-go
yeah.
for some.
But more from a political point of view than from a
Right, right. The
firefighting.
politics, exactly. The politics of it rears its head.
Yeah.
Maybe it needs another commissioner coming in and a top down, like most things, right? I mean, I think if you're talking about just briefly on amalgamation, I think you've said to me, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen by what, osmosis or something, like it's incrementally going to happen unless it's forced from the top down.
Yeah, municipalities and services don't reform themselves. That's the lesson. Like for 40 years in the business, I will tell you that it never happened voluntarily.
It's always a wailing and gnashing of teeth. So with the police services then, okay, so within our community, we have the police force or police services, and we have a police board. So talk about the police board for a moment there.
So policing in Canada, by and large, historically, has always tried to avoid the American model, where by and large there's political control of policing, whether through elections or through mayors and councils controlling policing, to try and keep the politics out of policing and keep a fine line. So that's why in Canada the model for policing has always been governance is separate, and so you can't have a mayor firing a police chief. You can't have a mayor telling the police, well, I want you to issue tickets on that road up there, or over here. We have strictly a system of law, and it's supposed to be applied fairly and equally without undue influence from anybody. So the government, and its wisdom over the years, and I think this is sort of a British model too, comes out of the British system, basically says we have to have separate governance, and we can't have undue political influence on policing. So that's the model in Canada, and that's the one that's here. So the system in Ontario has been where there is an Ontario police, where there are local police forces. There is a governing body, a police board, or a police commission, as they were called at one time, which was structured or set up to provide civilian governance to police. But even its ability to do things is restricted because the rules and regulations and legislation regarding policing are set by the province.
Right.
And so any kind of governance that's done by a local board or police commission is done within a framework established by the province. And very clearly, police members of police board and police commissions are told it is illegal and improper for you to interfere in the operations of a police force. You may not do that.
So what we're talking about is, and really we've got three, or we could say four groups. I'll just say them. There's the police force itself, which has the chief overseeing their operation. You've got the police board, which, and we'll talk about, it's comprised of 7 members right now.
Right.
You've got your local council, and then you have the province. So it's sort of like 4 different parts to this thing, each with their own respective roles.
Yep.
And the police board cannot tell the police chief what to do on a day-to-day basis.
No, they may not interfere in the operations. And if you as a police board member or as a board start to instruct the police chief on operations or any police officer on operations, you can be removed very quickly from office.
Right. So what is it the police board does then? Is it's sort of like some general guidance? How would you describe their role?
So the police board sort of the province sets out a framework for policing. They have rules and regulations and say, these are the things that you need to do. These are the things you need to take into consideration. And some of those things, you develop policies at the local level, how they're implemented on a broad basis, on a policy basis. And beyond that, then it's up to the chief to implement it beyond that. And so their role is really a policy role. They also have other duties. For example, they get to hire the chief. The chief, their employee, they get to hire the chief. I can't speak for other boards, but in our board, they have a role in the selection of the deputy chiefs. And also maybe then that's part of their role. Ultimately, the police chief is accountable to them within a framework. They just can't willy-nilly say, we want to get rid of you, goodbye, and do that. There's ways of dealing with personnel issues that are within the provincial legislation. So they can do that. They deal with issues such as property, budgets. The police board can set the budget. The police chief cannot unilaterally set the budget. They set the budget, and they set what the categories are within the budget. They deal with property. They deal with facilities. They deal with the radio system. All the tools that a police force needs to operate are within the realm of the police board as well.
Well, let me ask you one thing that came to mind. So, for example, patrol. Okay, police on the street, like in the downtown core or something like that.
Right.
Can the board say we would like to see a larger police presence in our communities, or and then the chief would see about how to implement that, or is that just something that the chief decides will be done or not, based on the budget that he or she has?
At the very end of the day, the board can't direct operations, but the board can have a discussion with the chief about what operations should look like. Okay. And I mean, any good senior manager will discuss with their board what they like and don't like, and what their interests are, and so that kind of discussion would take place fairly regularly, I think, with the chief. But at the end of the day, it's the chief who operationalizes things, and so if there was a conflict between the board wanted things to go in a certain way, and there was a conflict with the chief, that could end up in some difficulty in the relationship between the two of them. And ultimately, if the chief was going in a totally different direction from the board would, at least, now I've been out of it for a while, so there was a mechanism where the board could call in the Ontario Police Commission and say, take a look at what's going on here. We think that things aren't right, and they could do something like that.
Okay, so that's how the police would have to go, or the board would have to go to a provincial organization. If
in fact they wanted to dispense with the chief, or that's the way I understood it anyway.
Well, historically in Waterloo Region, did you run into that? I mean, you've been on the board. Okay, when were you first on the police board?
I went on in 80. I was on from 81 to 80 to 85, and then I went off the board when I became chair for 6 or 7 years. Although I maintained a close contact with the board, I was off the board. And then when the province changed the legislation to put the head of council back on, then I went back on again. So I went back on in 85, about 90, 91, 92, somewhere.
Yeah, early 90s until you retired.
Yeah.
Okay. So from that vast experience, was there ever a time that the board did run into a situation where they had to have the police chief removed, or a conflict?
Well, only one time was the Ontario Police Commission involved, and that was during the Sid Brown years.
Oh, okay.
Henchman, and so that was, and I can't recall whether the province imposed that or whether it was a request of the board, but the Ontario Police Commission did come in and held an inquiry on that.
Just give a brief synopsis of what, because a lot of people won't necessarily know what that is about, especially new people listening. But what was that situation about?
Well, when the regional police force was formed in 72, 73, Chief Heinrich was appointed. He was the Kitchener chief at that time, and he was appointed as the chief of the new force. And but he died in office a few years later. Oh. So the police board went to hire a new chief, and I won't get into why they did it, but they decided to hire outside, and they hired Sid Brown, who was the head of the police union in Toronto.
Oh.
And that created some friction within the force, and there was the creation of a tactical unit within the police force, which raided a henchman's headquarters. People leaked photographs of what happened at that event. There have been some other concerns raised about what was going on in the force, and the Ontario Police Commission came in and did an investigation and an inquiry and recommended a number of things. And flowing out of that inquiry, then the board of the day fired Brown, and the rest is history. It's an ongoing battle for a number of years. But so that's the only time the Ontario Police Commission, I'm aware of, was involved with Waterloo Region.
And what would that have been, early 80s, or when was that?
That happened in That happened about 1970, 78, 79,
Okay,
somewhere
so
in there.
late 70s, and then it
70.
extended into the 80s in terms
It,
of whatever
it went
legal
on, yeah,
disputes.
it went on within the courts or the firing for about 4 or 5 years after
Yeah.
that. Finally
Okay.
resolved and settled.
So it's interesting though, we always say, wow, if they had cameras back then when I was young, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's something that happened in late 70s where photos got leaked that resulted in some difficulty for the community to have to deal with, right?
Well, I think without getting into a lot of the detail, there were those people in the force who felt that the direction they were going was not appropriate, and obviously
Ah,
somebody leaked the photographs to make the point.
right, right.
Because there were other issues going on at the same time that came
Sure.
ahead as a result of that.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. So then, so back to the board for a second. And so I'm going to start with the composition of it now and work backwards. Currently, it's 7 people on the board, correct?
Right.
And so, what are those 7 people? Who are they?
So I stepped back. Originally, it was 5 people on the board.
Yeah, I was going to work back to that, but anyway, go ahead. 5.
Originally, it was 5 people. There were 3 provincial appointees and and 2 appointed from regional council as the
Okay.
funding body. Over the years, there was a lot of toing and froing with the province, saying municipalities paid virtually 100% of the cost of policing, yet the province controlled that spending.
Oh, by their 3 appointees.
There are 3 appointees; they control majority. And so, I think it was during the Harris years, if I'm not mistaken, there was a bit of on their part, there was a bit of a compromise. They didn't want to they didn't want to give up the idea that the councils actually ran police forces. They want to maintain this separation, this distance. So their compromise was, we'll appoint 3, you appoint 3 people from council, including the head of council, or 2 and 2 or 3 and 3, depending on the size of your board.
Right.
And you can appoint the 4th person. The council can appoint the 4th person, but it can't be a politician. It has to be a lay person. So the current makeup now is 3 political appointees from the province, 3 appointees, including the chair from the region, and then 1 lay person appointed by regional council whose appointment is subject to regional council reappointment at that time. So it, in essence, gave them the regional council a majority vote, but really it wasn't majority vote.
So, right. But the 3 appointees from the province, though, wouldn't they generally be like local individuals who are lay people, or is that?
They're all local people, and quite frankly, they for a long time they were known to the government.
Okay. Sure. You mean they might have been the same political persuasion?
Well, I would, yeah, that's probably a good way of describing it. And then there was for a period of time, there was a appointment or application process. And but that still didn't, at the end of the day, the government made the final choice of who the people were to be.
Right.
The odd time when I was an officer, there would be sometimes when the government would call me and say, what do you think of this person? Is this person appropriate? But that was not the normal practice. Very seldom that happened.
And you'd say no, but they would appoint the person anyway. No, I'm just kidding. But so was there ever a situation where you felt that the province was dictating how these people were making their decisions? Like, was there ever a conflict within the board that way?
No, I never had that experience. There was never any control by the province of their appointees that I'm aware of.
So the expansion happened, was it to get the head of council onto the board, or why was there the expansion?
Well, I think one of the concerns at the time was that in the single tier cities where they had police forces, the mayor automatically went on. But in the regions, the head of council wasn't automatically on. The head of council had to vie with other council members to get on the police board.
Yeah.
When that council was what supplied all the money for the police board.
Right. So
I think the province wanted to try and equalize things with the single tier cities that existed.
Yeah. So the province then didn't have say over the layperson that the regional council would appoint.
No, not at all.
Okay. So and did that resolve this issue about feeling like you were paying all the money but not having any control?
Well, I think it went part way, but it wasn't totally what municipalities wanted, but it was the best they could do because I think it was a battle. They didn't, at the end of the day, they didn't think they were going to win. So it was a
Yeah.
compromise.
So let's talk about then regional council's role for a second here, because I mean, currently the police budget makes up about 1/3 of the regional property tax bill.
Right. Not
Right.
1/3 of the expenses, but 1/3 of the property tax bill.
Right, right. Property tax bill. I'm not going to get into the nuances of what that exactly means in tax talk,
Right.
because I don't have Mr. Dyer here beside me to guide me through it, but like back in regional council days. But so the general sentiment is, well, regional council, okay, so you've got the chief doing the day-to-day, you've got the board providing some policy concepts or broad stroke ideas for community policing or what have you. But so what regional councils, when I first got there, was like you can either vote yes or no, or you couldn't do anything about
Right.
it. And I appreciate there's things you can't do, but there are some things you can do. So why don't you explain the role?
So regional council provides the financing for the regional police. But what happens is legally, the budget is delivered to the regional council. The regional council can comment on it, ask questions about it, can send it back for further consideration. But at the end of the day, they either vote for it or they don't. They can't pick and choose in the budget. They can't say, well, we want you to shift money from this category over to this category. That's an operational issue. That's the responsibility of the police board, who works with the chief. In our region, we've never had a time that I'm aware of that the regional council has rejected the police budget. They've been different times when the police chief, and there's always been, particularly since the early 90s, a really good working relationship between the regional administration and the police administration and regional council and the police board. And so there have been times when, there always is every year, the chief comes to regional council, talks about the issues facing them. Here's our budget. Here's how we're proposing to deal with things. We've heard from various voices that you're interested in this. This is how we're proposing to deal with this. And they have that discussion in an open council meeting. It's not a closed council meeting. It's done
Right.
open. And then sometimes when there's been crunch years, tough years, the council will say, can you find a way of shaving another 0.5% off your budget request, because it's a big impact on our levy. And usually what will happen is the police board and the chief will take it back. And generally speaking, they've been able to do those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, when the final budget comes back, the council either has to approve it or reject it, in which case then the Ontario Civilian Police Commission, or whatever it's called now, would come in and be the arbiter at the end of the day. That's happened in other municipalities, but it hasn't.
Yeah. So I just wanted to touch on that for a second. But so it comes back. Regional council basically approves, we'll say, the envelope of cash, so to speak,
Yep.
that can be spent, and then the police chief can determine how that's going to be spent. And the board provides some overall general direction ideas about what they want to.
Yeah, although in all the presentations, regional council has seen the breakout of the budget. They're just not given a
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply that. No. You're right. I mean, the chief is saying, this is how I'm going to spend what I'm asking you for in these areas. But again, regional council can't say, well, they might say like it or not, but they can't say, well, take $10 million. Well, anyway, we won't get into all of that, but regional council is restricted in terms of what they can do in that approval.
That's right.
Okay.
Only the police board could do that.
Now, if regional council wanted to say, well, we're going to we want to reduce the overall budget, like you said, the shaving, in the past, there's been cooperation in terms of coming to that number. If both sides are entrenched, what happens then?
Well, if you come to a conflict, as has happened in other municipalities, the Ontario Police Commission, or whatever it's called today.
I think it's the Ontario Civilian Police Commission now.
Yeah, so it would go before them.
Okay, so that's like, now, have you ever been involved in that sort of a
No,
hearing?
never, never. It's like an arbitration hearing,
Yeah,
basically. And so you would have to, the council would have to put up an argument saying why this number should be what
right,
it is.
right,
And the police
right,
board would come back and say, well, you know, we can't do this. We can't have this many people on the street without this kind of money to do this, or we can't
right.
do this kind of operation, or we'll have to shut down this kind of service. And this board will then decide whether it's reasonable or unreasonable. They always, the language is really rather strange. I would say talked about ability to pay. Municipal councils will say, well, they're not considering the ability to pay. This is quite often the case in police arbitrations. That's how
Yes.
but it's a bit of a moot point because the tax base is rather flexible, and so I think the issue is really is it a reasonable request? But as I said, we in Waterloo Region have never been faced with that issue.
Yeah. And just to touch on that for a second, police pay is something that comes up as a question. What's going on out there, but aren't we sort of stuck? We're the tip of the tail that's being wagged that tells us where things are going to go in terms of percentage increase or retention pay by other jurisdictions, and then it sort of filters through across the province.
Right. Well, both police and firefighters have compulsory binding arbitration as part of their legislative framework. And so what happened both in firefighting and in policing was that whoever settled first or had a settlement imposed, that sort of set the trend for bargaining right down the line. So even though a salary increase would be 1% or 2% higher than the general labor force in the municipalities got, if that was in one police force, it just sort of filtered its way right through. And so that often put pressure on police budgets during my time there. And then the last few years have been much more in line with the general settlements. But there were years when the settlements or the working conditions were thought to be a little on the rich side relative to the other sectors.
But we were stuck, weren't we? I mean, if Toronto gave 3%, or the police services were able to obtain 3% out of Toronto, and then you have hearings along the way, Wellington, Peel,
Yep.
Waterloo Region, we were stuck with the 3% probably. You couldn't get 1%.
It's pretty hard. I think most police boards who came along a little later felt that there wasn't much chance of going to arbitration, going the costs and the bad labor relations going to arbitration when you knew what the arbitrator was going to do anyway, because the pattern was already set.
Because this concept you mentioned, that this ability to pay, was that a factor that they didn't consider because it wasn't part of the legislation to consider that factor, or what was?
So the ability to pay was actually part of the legislation, but the reality is that it was from where I sat, it was a meaningless concept because all you had to do was raise the taxes a quarter of a percent. You could pay that extra money easily, and so that didn't, the overall scheme of things, it didn't seem like a lot, but it was significant money when you sort of juxtapose the regional budget, the rest of the regional budget and the police
Right.
budget. There were many in the 90s and early 2000s. We were actually seeing where we were shaving regional programs to try and keep the overall property tax rate down because the police budget was consuming a greater and greater share of the regional tax.
Right. And at the same time, during that period of time, you're dealing with like the Harris downloads that were happening on top of everything else.
But this predates Harris. This goes back right into the Liberal NDP, because it was all the same. The police unions and the firefighters unions have always been extremely strong influences with the government, regardless of the party.
So for the arbitrators, parity amongst the various services was more important than the issue of ability to pay because they felt communities could pay.
Yep.
And that's where you got retention bonuses from too.
Right. Well, the retention bonuses came about because they gave them in Toronto. And the case was made, well, we're having a hard time retaining police officers in Toronto. The irony of it was that when people went back and took a look at retention in Toronto, it was the same as elsewhere. But it was an argument that carried the day in Toronto. And once it was there in Toronto, and then we never understood why, but the Ontario Provincial Police came along and accepted it right after that. So once it went between Toronto and the OPP, it just rolled right through the entire system.
And once one domino fell, like you said, all the rest just came tumbling down.
Because we certainly never had any trouble retaining police officers.
So let me just ask you, I just wanted to touch base. You mentioned some of the former police chiefs, two of them anyway. You said Chief Heinrich. What was his first name? I'm sorry, I don't know.
Well, I think it was Wilf.
Okay. And then there was Sid Brown. And then who followed Sid Brown?
Harold Bassey.
Yeah.
Harold had been the chief in Waterloo prior to amalgamation and was a deputy under Heinrich and under Brown. And then he became the next chief, and did a great job of pulling that force together. Laid the groundwork it was actually Harold who laid the groundwork for community-based policing, which his successor was Larry Greville, and Harold had done a fair bit of work with Larry, and Larry worked on that. So when Larry became chief, that Larry just took that whole concept and expanded it much more broadly. And then when Larry retired after about 20 years,
it's Matt Turigian?
Matt Turigian became the chief, and then he went off to be the deputy minister and was succeeded by Brian Larkin.
Right. So when you talk about community policing, is that the Citizens on Patrol program, or what?
No, it was more a function of, instead of moving police all around the community on a regular basis, keep people there, a relationship with community organizations, neighborhood watches, all those sorts of things that sort of brought the police right into the community and made the community participants in policing.
I think I'll have Brian Stortz on someday to talk about the COPS program, the Citizens on Patrol, especially with the whole downtown Kitchener core, right, the bad old crack house days and all of that was happening. So, and when a police chief is selected, that's the board does that hiring as a board, or how is that? How has that been done?
The board makes that decision, and that's the board hire is the chief.
And you mentioned also the deputy chief as well.
Well, we were always involved in interviewing and being part of the selection of the deputy chief, at least in our board.
I had a note down about we were talking about budget, and I mentioned the budget before. And obviously the tax base is the largest portion of the revenue to fund that. I guess ticketing would be another source.
There's no relationship between ticketing and police revenues.
Okay, I think that's a good point. Why don't you just expound on that a bit?
So until the year 2000, all ticket revenues went to the province. And then as part of the transfer services that took place between the province and the municipalities, right, in order to try and sort of level out the new expenditures that the province was downloading with giving some new revenue sources, the province turned over the POA, the Provincial Offences Act revenues,
right,
to local governments. In the case of our region, that came to the regional municipality of Waterloo, which operates the POA courts, and that goes into general revenue. Because we're very careful not to say that we never want people seem to say, well,
right,
issue more tickets, you get more money for the policing. Well, they don't get any money out of that, and we don't want to link that to that because enforcement should be neutral, and it should be based on getting more money for the police organization.
And that's similar to the red light camera revenues.
Red light cameras go into the general revenues as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And recently there's been some use of cameras for speeders to capture speeders, and I'm wondering if that's a provincial or that's going to be a municipal run.
I believe I'm out of it, but I believe that will be same as the red light the red light cameras with the fines would come into the general.
Yeah.
They'll process it through the local POA courts, which are paid for by the region.
Yeah.
But those courts aren't independent.
Okay. Well, listen, Ken, I just we're going to wrap it up here, and I really appreciate your time and thoughts on providing us with some of the contextual historical background as to what's been happening in Waterloo Region with policing, because as we know, it's certainly a topic of interest in the community and over the past year, and I think it's going to be a very interesting topic over the next few years as we look at upcoming budgets and what's going to be happening in that process. Because as we know, budgets dictate everything about a community. If it's not in the budget, it's not really going to happen in your community. So really that's where, if anything's going to happen, it's got to happen there. So we'll see how that goes. But again, thanks again for sharing your thoughts about what's gone on in the past and providing us with some of that background.
Great. Good to be with you.
Okay, all the best, and we'll meet up again soon.
Yep. Okay. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Okay, so thank you again for listening to another edition of the Old Grey Mares. My name is Rob Deutschman. I want to thank my friend Alex Kinsella for putting it all together and making the magic happen. And you, the listener, for taking the time to listen. And again, if you have any issue or topic or person that you think would be an interesting interview, please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to make it all happen.